So what that should give you, and this is, let me actually hide this, it's really hard to see. So theoretically, what we have now is if we play this, we just get this really aggressive, crazy stream of particles just like falling downwards insanely. And before we go super crazy far into doing sims, there's 2 or 3 things that I want to sort of bring up. They are relevant for particles as well as fire, fluids, end cloth, any other weird stuff you're doing. So it's less obvious for this particular particle sim, but whenever you are trying to simulate anything, pretty much, in Maya, it is very, very important that you put your viewport or your playback speed to something that is playing every frame. So you could do free, I usually cap it at real time, but make sure that it plays every frame. If it doesn't, it has the potential to screw up your simulation and it will look not at all accurate to sort of how it should look, or in the worst case, it'll actually just blow up, like literally just blow up. Setting it to real time, we get this much slower stream of particles. So that's the first thing is, again, playback speed is actually very important for this. In terms of actually making sparks, so I'm more of a fluid person for like fire and smoke than I am particles. But basically, there's sort of 2 different parts of a particle system. There is the emitter, and that is the thing that produces particles, and then there's the actual particles themselves. So both of them have different properties on them that you can kind of edit and modify. You'll find that it's the same thing with the fluid sim for like fire, stuff like that. So if you're ever wanting to, you can key the emitter. So if you're ever, again, like needing, I don't know, maybe flames on a sparkler or something like that, like you could attach emitter to a cylinder and just like have it shooting out crazy little sparks or something like that. And then as you wave the, as you wave the sparkler around, it would like shoot out sparks. That seems like potentially it could be relevant to your uses. So there's a few different ways, we'll start with just looking at the emitter itself. Get rid of all the keyframes on this. There's different things that you can do with the emitter. So one is actually changing the direction or changing the emitter type. So before it was set to Omni, it'll just sort of like spawn a bunch of random particles. This is directional, and I'm not gonna lie, I have never found a use for this personally. I know that there are some. What?
A fountain? Like if you had a fountain?
Yeah. Well, if you had a fountain, particles are kind of the wrong thing for doing water. But yeah, I mean, I guess that would work. It's just like a weird, just the way these generate particles, like it's generating, if you, God.
Hey man, I was just trying to push an idea for one.
No, I mean, it's like totally like, I did a whole smoke sim with particles once, and my teacher was like, why did you do a whole smoke sim with particles? And I'm like, I learned a thing. But yeah, no, I mean, you can totally make water with particles. It would just be like a little bit more of like a stylized sort of like bubble water. But if that's what you're shooting for, you could totally do that. With directional though, it is weird because like if you look at this, it's actually many, many itty bitty tiny particles like lumped into the same spot. It's just a strange way for the thing to function. I am actually really quickly going to change the size of these particles. So if you go into the particle itself, I think under shading, if you switch it to something like spheres instead of points, it will make these a little bit more visible. So this would be good for like particle water. You could retexture these as like whatever you wanted. And I'm just gonna go in and somewhere there's a size for this. I honestly just don't remember where it is. So I'm just gonna leave this for now. What the heck? So anywho, so directional, there's surface emitters, which usually is going to want to be attached to some kind of mesh. I'll show you that in a second. And then there's also like curve, honestly, I've never used. I assume that would also be attached to something like, a curve. There's also volume emitters, and this is basically going to, instead of having all of these particles generated from a specific point, it's just going to sort of make them in the random shape of whatever this crazy little emitter thing is. So you should be able, unless I'm going crazy, I might be, there's better ways to sort of change the shape, but you should be able to just sort of scale that out, and then it will make this like weird snowing effect. In this case, that's probably not what you're shooting for. So I'm just going to go ahead and set this back to Omni. This is probably personally my favorite for making sparks. The other thing that you can do with particles is, in terms of, like, again, purely looking at the emitter, you can change the number of particles being spawned. You could set this to 0 if you want. So for sparks, if you're going to have like a gunshot hit something or something, you can do like psh, psh, and do like a series of sparks. You can make them go faster and it'll look way less crazy. That makes sense. Yeah. Okay, yeah, so for soldering, you probably just have like a constant thing with like psh, just shooting out. Well, actually, so soldering usually doesn't make sparks. It just works by heating up the metal, and then you like touch other metal to it, and then that melts. Yeah. Welding, though, that makes sparks. That was actually what I tried to do. I tried to do sparks for a welding project when I was taking a sim class, and it looked terrible. But yeah, so I mean, this would be really good for like sort of welding sparks. Soldering actually will make smoke if you ever are in the mood to do a smoke sim. But what you can do, so if you want, I've turned my emitter off. You can mess with the sort of minimum and maximum distance, theoretically, that this is going to generate particles from. So by playing with these, it kind of makes a little bit of the effect of a volume emitter, where it's just sort of like, hey, generate particles anywhere between this distance and this distance away. I usually, honestly, just kind of leave them set to 0. You can also mess with the speed of the particles. So this is probably what you'd want to mess with for sparks. You should be able to set this to something like crazy, crazy high. That will give you a little bit more of a sort of sparky effect. It's very, very crazy. And then there's some other stuff that you can play with. So I'm going to leave the speed like that for now and just sort of see what we can do in terms of actual particles. But that's usually, I think, most of what I do with the emitter itself. It's literally just changing how these particles are spawned in the environment. If you look at the particle system, then you have other options that you can sort of mess with in there. And actually, I think I'm going to turn the speed down slightly just to demo a few things, and I'll probably turn it back up. So in the particles themselves, you have different options. It'll give you, if you sort of pause it every once in a while and like look at, it'll tell you how many particles are currently in your scene. It'll also show you the lifespan of the particles. So this is something you would definitely want to look at for sparks, and also not crashing your computer if you're spawning a lot of particles. By default, these are set to live forever, so they will pretty much never go away. They will just keep falling and interacting with whatever in your Maya scene. So what you can do is set this to constant. So this is going to be, I believe it goes, I actually don't know what unit this is set to. It's either like 1 second or like, 24 frames, or it's like a unit of something. What I usually do is sort of random range. So you can just add, significant randomness to this, and it's just going to sort of like start killing these particles at a little bit different speeds than it would previously. Similar to what we did with MASH, where you can sort of like change the seed to generate, or like to change how the particles are dying. You can mess with that as well if you want. But this is going to be good. It'll allow your sparks to sort of die in, different range and look a little bit more varied. There's different options. Oh, here we go. Particle radius. So we can make these giant, mushy, squishy water blobs. Or again, like tiny sparks. And if you are doing anything like sparks, they're going to be moving so fast that when you turn on motion blur, like you can just have them as tiny spheres. That's totally fine. When you turn on motion blur, it should pick up that glow and like make the kind of sparky effect. And then the other thing that's kind of cool is collide. So right now this is set to, if you have any like ground planes or whatever in your scene, it'll collide with that. You can, if you want, turn on self collide. And you'll notice that like it actually changes the way that these are being spawned. So for sparks, I think they're small enough it probably doesn't matter. But what this does is the particles are behaving like bouncy balls, basically, where they're like hitting each other, and they won't spawn on top of each other. You can also mess with their, collide strength or whatever. So just kind of different ways to affect that. Where particles get kind of fun is you can change the way they sort of affect